Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Without a doubt, I would call myself a fan of the British royal family. I've visited many of the royal palaces in the UK. I've binged on all seasons of the Netflix series The Crown, watched Downton Abbey with obsessive interest, and any book that references the royal family will undoubtedly be a must-read for me. So it was with much intrigue that I learned about my next guest and his debut novel, The Tour. Based on one of the biggest events in Australian history, the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II's royal tour in 1954, this book is a fascinating and somewhat wicked exploration of what might have gone on behind the scenes of that historic event. It's got everything you love in a period drama: scandal, intrigue, and characters you love to hate. Thoroughly delightful read. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Andrew Mackie to the podcast today. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, thanks for having me, Claudine.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I wanted to say congratulations on this marvellous book. You must be so incredibly proud of it, and a debut to boot.
Yeah, it's kind of weird because I didn't really set out initially to write a book, and it's just so wonderful to walk into a shop and see it sitting there on the shelf with far more legitimate authors than myself.
I don't believe that. Yes, this is very legitimate. But I wanted to ask you, how long did it take you to write this book from idea to completion?
It's an interesting one because I initially wrote it as a screenplay, and I found that really difficult. I was really unhappy with the progress. So it was probably about, and that's when I decided to do it as a novel to explore these characters and this story a little more in depth. So it was meant to be more a development exercise than necessarily setting out to write a novel. But the novel took on a life of its own. There was probably about 3 to 6 months of research. Then it probably took about 6 months to write the first draft. And then when the publisher picked it up, there was a deadline for me to deliver the finished version, which incorporated the editor's notes, which was a rather kind of wild 3 months. And that 3 months was a very condensed workload. It was probably more like 6 months' work done in 3 months. So it's a very long answer, but yeah, probably took about a year to year and a half.
The Queen is such a central character in this book, and even though she's off the page for a lot of the time, was she or has she always been a source of fascination for you?
No, I don't think she has. I mean, the royal family, I wouldn't call myself a monarchist, but in my other job as a film distributor, I've seen how films about the royal family have succeeded. And I was working on the King's Speech where I thought there's got to be a story that is in the intersection of the royal family and Australian history. And it was this tour that fit the bill beautifully.
So, I mean, I guess that leads me on to my next question: how it was that you came to be writing about the Queen's 1954 tour. What was the spark that sent you searching in this direction?
Yeah, look, I think the spark was I saw this photo, this wonderful black and white photo, which you can Google and find. And I was just researching royal family in Australia, and this photo came up of the Queen visiting the Wagga Wagga agricultural show on that 1954 tour. And it's this wonderful shot of the Queen being paraded along a line of sheep bums. All these farmers are holding their sheep with their bums facing towards the Queen, proudly on display. And it was just something about the tone of that and the hilarity of it, the sort of formal hilarity that thought that kind of nails the spirit of the book I would love to write. And then I read about, the deeper I got into the research, I read about this incident in which the Queen and Prince Philip had a fight during the tour on their weekend off, and it was captured momentarily on film. And I thought, okay, they had a fight. That can be a major anchor for my book in terms of the narrative structure. And it sort of developed from there.
That incident was dramatised in an episode of The Crown. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Yes.
At the time, if truth be told, I wasn't entirely sure that it was based on fact until I read your book. So I wanted to know, could you tell me a little bit about that incident and the research you undertook to bring this story to the page?
A lot of my research was based on the research of Jane Connors, who's written extensively about the royal family and the tours of Australia. And she wrote a book called The Royal Tours of Australia. And she's the one, I think, who really uncovered this incident through her research. The thing about that incident is that it's fascinating because the royal couple didn't know there was a newsreel camera crew at the perimeter of a property they were staying in. They filmed the Queen chasing Prince Philip out of a house with tennis shoes, and she threw a tennis racket at him, and they were yelling at each other. And then they saw this camera crew, and one of the Queen's representatives approached them, and the camera crew pretty much voluntarily exposed the film in front of the representative and destroyed it, because that was just how the media's relationship was with the royal family back then. You didn't write anything negative about the royal family, you'd lose all your access. So yeah, it felt to me like, wow, we'll never know what happened really behind the scenes, and the Crown, has a great dramatic stab at it. I kind of let my imagination run wild as to what could have happened behind the scenes, and my version definitely didn't happen, but I had a lot of fun coming up with it.
I was wondering, for those who haven't had the privilege of reading your book like I have, could you tell me a little bit more about the story?
Yeah, so my story is about twin sisters, Violet and Daisy, who live in London in the early 1950s. They've lost their mother, they've lost their father. Life's pretty grim, but they fluke a job working for Lady Caroline, who happens to be going on the Queen's tour of Australia within a matter of weeks as her lady in waiting. And when other people fall out of the tour, they're given this opportunity to travel as maids on this epic tour, which lasts a couple of months across Australia, from the major cities to the small towns. And there's conflict between them. I won't give away certain plot details, but they essentially hate each other. So it's about their relationship over the course of this sort of momentous event that takes them away from home for 6 months and to the far reaches of Australia.
Indeed. It was just a wonderful, delightfully wicked story, as I said before. And I have to say that I think it's important to reflect on the staggering extent of the tour that the Queen undertook in that period. It was a mere 5 months after she was crowned, and she left her 2 young children behind to embark on a 6-month tour of the Commonwealth with her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. They travelled by air, sea, road and train. And in Australia alone, as you've already mentioned, they visited so many towns and cities, I think 57. A phenomenal feat, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I don't think we'd ever see it again. I mean, she was away from her 2 young children. I think they were 2 and 5 or 3 and 5 at the time. And she was away for 6 months, and she went all over Australia. She was a relatively recently crowned monarch. So it's the first time a reigning monarch had visited Australia, and it was like an Olympic scale event. There's one statistic that blew my mind, which was 75% of the population actually saw her in person, and entire towns travelled hundreds of kilometres just to glimpse her. It was a major undertaking at a time long before fax and email, and it really was. It was like an Olympic-sized event.
Now, the Cheddle sisters, let's talk a little bit about Daisy and Violet. I had a bundle of contradictory reactions to these women. They were both incredibly flawed, endearing, yet frustrating, cruel and sometimes manipulative, but also incredibly loyal and damaged, I guess. So I wanted to know, where did the inspiration for these characters come from?
I guess in my early drafting, it was one character, but I found structurally, when you take a single character on the road, you need something for them to react to and for someone to escalate the drama with. And there was only so much I could do with the actual royals, because you start to get into areas of defamation. So I thought, well, what if they're sisters? And then I thought, well, what if they're twin sisters? And I guess that was my film producer brain kicking in there, because I thought, well, given the advancements in technology, and you look at a film like The Social Network, where one actor can play twin brothers quite convincingly, I thought, well, this could be a great opportunity for one actor to play both sisters, and that acting challenge may actually be a bit of a draw card to attracting a sort of a higher level of actor. So it was a bit self-serving in some ways, but the more I got into those two characters as twin sisters, identical twin sisters, it was challenging to write, but I think a great structure to sort of let drama unfold. But difficult, and I would say it took it took the rewrite, I think, to really try to delineate their personalities a little more. One of the things my editor suggested and we did in the rewrite was completely change the whole point of view of the book. So a lot of their persona was developed during that second pass. The trap I kept falling into on the first draft was they were just too similar.
Did you find it challenging to be writing from a young woman's point of view?
No, not at all, because I find I'm quite bored with writing men's characters. I'm just not interested in them. And I find female characters far more complex and interesting. And that's just where my fascination lies. And when I have to write a male character, the male characters in the book are probably far less well drawn, I think, than the female characters, and that's just because that's what I'm interested in. I don't know why. I just find myself drawn to female points of view, and I mean, the book I'm writing now is a female protagonist, and it's kind of my comfort zone, and I'm not sure why, but I just find it more interesting.
I found it really fascinating. I mean, it's not just one female point of view, it's two. And it's also females that are historical in the sense that, you're writing about, 1950s women. You're also writing about 1950s fashion and ideals. So, I just found it a really fascinating point of discussion for this book.
I mean, as any writer would appreciate, writing this book, historical fiction, without the internet would be double the work. Unfortunately, writing about the royal family, there's so much material to draw on that I could still be researching it now if I wanted, like a year or two later. There's endless material to work with, and every day of the tour there was multiple newspapers covering the tours. So the depth of research available is immense. But yeah, I mean, I enjoy historical fiction. I don't know anything about that era. When I started writing this book, I didn't really know anything about the royal family. I just do my research and pull out the bits of info I feel are good for the book. And when I'm writing about, London, a street in London in the 1950s where the girls live, I'll pull up Google Maps and I'll walk around the street and I'll Google specific props I need. And I guess I sort of approach it like a filmmaker, like a production designer or a screenwriter, in that I imagine the scene and I imagine how I'm going to set decorate it. And I Google London 1954 brands of soap, and my internet search history on this book is sort of goes on for miles. Hopefully, in the end, it adds up to a convincing whole.
Oh, absolutely it does. You've been at pains to point out that much of what occurs in the tour is fictionalised. The Queen's actual tour and itinerary has been altered, dates, places, etc. So tell me, why did you do this?
It's a weird one, because on one level I tried to be as factual as possible in terms of the events of the tour, the public-facing events, the dates, the places. And then behind that, I completely fantasize and create a story that is complete fiction. So it's this weird writing exercise where on one level I'm trying to be factual in order to be able to tell this complete fabrication of the story. But a couple of things we switched around in terms of dates and places, because the tour itself was all over the place. The Queen would go to Sydney, and then she'd go, I'm just making this up for example, but she'd go to Sydney, then she might fly to Bundaberg, come back to Sydney that next day. Then she might go to Lismore and a couple of country towns, and then fly back to Queensland, and then down to Melbourne, and then back to Queensland. I knew I wanted to hit certain places at various points in the arc of the story. For example, there's a scene in Broken Hill that's a pivotal scene in terms of the third act of the book. And where that occurs in the actual tour, it was just a bit too early for where I wanted it to, because I wanted them to go to other places before Broken Hill. So that there was a few instances where I just shifted the itinerary around a little to suit the dramatic arc. In terms of the public-facing content of the novel, it was fact-checked, and we were pretty hard on ourselves in terms of getting it right.
So speaking of that event in Broken Hill, I found that one of the interesting aspects of the novel, apart from the shoe throwing incident, of course. It's the radio broadcast transmission between the wife of a cattle station owner living in remote Australia and the Queen, speaking from the Royal Flying Doctor Base in Broken Hill.
Mm,
Hazel Lawson in the book is that woman that the Queen speaks with, and I believe she was inspired by a real life character who the
yeah,
Queen actually did speak with. Is that right?
that's correct. Yeah, I think her real name's Hazel Mitchell, and she was living at the time on a very remote cattle station out near Lake Eyre, and the Queen wanted to do a radio broadcast conversation with the family living in sort of the outback, and it was broadcast around the world. The tour organisers found this family living not far from a little town called Maree, and I think the descendants may still live on the station. I thought, okay, wow, this is gold. This is so good. This is be a wonderful place to take the two girls, and they sort of veer off the main tour of the Queen to resolve their own history. But I love that the Queen was having this radio dialogue with a remote parent. Just felt to me like there's something about it that felt that it was perfect to be dramatized.
Now, there are other characters in the book inspired by real life characters. Can you tell me about a couple of them?
Yeah, in fact, almost all the touring party are based on real people. Lady Caroline is based on one of the ladies in waiting on the tour called Lady Alice Edgerton, who was a long-time lady in waiting with the Queen. In fact, I think in the 70s she committed suicide, and it was the internet rumor is that she spoke to the Queen about Prince Philip's numerous infidelities, and was sacked as a lady in waiting and went into a deep depression. I don't know if that's true, but when I read about this, I thought, okay, well, my lady in waiting, Lady Caroline's going to be based on Lady Edgerton. You know, Pamela Mountbatten, Lady Mountbatten was one of the ladies in waiting on the Australian tour, and she features in the book. Yeah, there's numerous characters who are based on real people. There are things that happen in the book that sound like they're made up, but they aren't. Like the invention of Aerogard, which was a chemical formula the CSIRO developed for the 63 tour, the next tour, for the Royal Touring Party to keep the flies off the Queen when she travelled to the outback. So they invented this thing and they trialled it on some of the Queen's staff, and it worked, and that formula ended up being used for commercial use and became the product Aerogard. So there's some kind of wonderful little factoids like that I was able to weave through the novel.
Yes, and you did so in such a wonderful, almost hilarious way.
Yeah, yes. I'm just hoping none of the royal family read what I've done with their with their history.
Oh dear. If there was anything you'd like readers to take away from this book, what would it be?
Look, I just want people to have fun with it. It doesn't take itself seriously, but I think it would be that I guess the theme I was trying to explore was no matter how bad your relationship might be with your family or your sisters, it can always be salvaged. I think we get that message across. And also, the message I wanted to explore was how horrible it must be to be the Queen. and it all looks like they're kind of, they're wealthy and privileged from the outside, but I don't think I'd want her job. I wouldn't do it for the world. And to do that for, how old is she now? She's been alive
92 or something, isn't she?
92, yeah. So she's probably been doing formal duties for over 70 years, and 70 years of small talk and not being able to go outside without being evaluated. Wow. I mean, I'm surprised she's as stable and as calm as she is. So yeah, so I think that's I definitely wanted to get into, the other side of being a royal.
Now, Andrew, you have mentioned it, but it was remiss of me not to mention earlier that you are, in fact, a film distributor and producer, and that your company acquired and released the Oscar-winning film The King's Speech and the Oscar-nominated film Lion. You've also produced other wonderful films such as Ride Like a Girl, a terrific film in my opinion, Holding the Man and On Chesil Beach. So on that basis, I wanted to ask, do you intend to develop this story for the screen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was kind of written with that intention, and we're sort of developing it now. And since it's been published, we've had some really interesting approaches from bigger production companies who are sort of sniffing around it. So it's a watch this space situation, and these things literally take years. I think the success of The Crown and this sort of enduring fascination with the royal family. I mean, it really is just an ongoing. It's the world's longest running soap opera. I think should ensure that should be as relevant, I think, in 5 years as it is now. So yeah, look, watch this space where we'd love to get it adapted for the screen.
Let's play devil's advocate here. If you were to get this novel onto the screen in some way, shape, or form, who do you see playing the roles of Violet and Daisy?
Yes, well, Saoirse Ronan, definitely. Or I don't know if you've seen The Queen's Gambit on Netflix, but Anya Taylor-Joy, I think, could be interesting as well. And these actors, I would love to play both parts.
So how different do you think screenwriting is from novel writing?
Yeah, it's funny. What I loved about novel writing is there's no meetings. You just write. And you have this wonderful freedom where if I want to do a deep dive on the contents of somebody's suitcase, for example, I can, and as long as it's entertaining and engaging, then I can go down that rabbit hole. Whereas screenwriting, it's a bit like you're writing a financial prospectus. You need to make sure it's a great story and that it's well written, but you also have these considerations of budget and all these sort of practical concerns that take the fun out of it, really. And then the screenplays, I mean, I'm so used to kind of being tough on screenplays myself because that's my job, is reading them and weighing them up. I thought, I know that a good screenplay has to have maybe 10, 12, 15 drafts written, and the shooting draft may not resemble the first draft, and then even your final draft, the director may take it and completely change things again, and you're one part of a long process. And I love the finality of writing a novel and it's done, and I don't have people telling me to change it. To an extent, look, you do to an extent. You hand it in to a publisher and they make suggestions, great suggestions, and as an editor, and you fix it. But yeah, screenplays, it's a completely different beast.
Andrew, given your experiences with both screenwriting and now this novel, I wondered if you had any tips to offer aspiring writers who might be listening.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, I didn't think this novel would get published, but if I can give any advice, I would say put as much work into what you're writing about as the novel itself, because I think you need to. It would really help unless you are such a wonderful writer that the quality of your writing elevates your book to being published. I would say pick something that has cut through in terms of its. And this comes from me as a movie guy. What's the pitch? And writing about the royal family, for me, I immediately, if this book was not about the royal family, I probably would have done a quarter of the interviews, and I don't think Penguin would have taken it on. And, I feel like I've written about something that has a guaranteed built-in audience and fascination. So I would say, and I guess it's the same with film, I always feel like, certainly for your first film or book, try to write about something that has a unique point of difference and a commerciality that can cut through. And that doesn't mean, I'm not saying forego your integrity, and it can be, it still needs to be your voice, but I just write about something that has a built-in travel in terms of its, when you describe it to somebody in one or two sentences, they go, oh, I'd really like to read that. Some books and films are deeply personal and they're great works of art. And if that's your first book, then then absolutely I respect that. But I think for me, writing about something like the royal family carried this book much further into the market than if I hadn't written about the royal family. And then I feel like now I'm well positioned to perhaps write something that is more personal or is more what I want to write. Yeah, I guess that's sort of a bit of crude advice, but I think it's if your objective is to be published and for your book to be distributed widely, it really helps.
I don't think it's crude. I think it's reality.
Yeah, and I guess for people who haven't written one yet, and you might agree, for me, I was sort of intimidated by starting and intimidated by the enormity of actually getting 80,000 coherent words into a word processor. But for me, that was kind of much easier than I thought. The harder part was fixing it and rewriting it and dealing with the kind of fatigue of just wanting to move on from it, but having to go back to it time and time again. And also I found in the last sort of 10,000, 20,000 pages, you kind of start to think, oh, I'm going to be leaving this world. My head's been in this place for 6 months and it's like a second home and it's all going to be gone soon. So you start to sort of miss the book as well at a certain point until you're forced to rewrite it and fix it. And then it's like, oh, I just want to move on to the next one. I guess what I really want to say is, and I don't know if you found this, but don't be intimidated by the enormity of that first draft, because it's just one part of the process.
With all of that in mind, you mentioned that you're working on another novel. Is it a more personal story?
No, but it's just a sort of a silly idea that I had, and it hasn't got the hooks, the commercial hooks of the tour, or necessarily the adaptability. But I mean, I'll tell you, it's based on, I went to a Telluride in Colorado for a film festival and went to a little museum there. And I found for sale was this book called The Tomboy Bride, and it was a found diary that was hidden away and found a number of years back and published. And it's about a newly married woman living on the top of a snow-covered mountain in 1900. Her husband works in the mines, and it's just about the difficulty of her life. But it's such a fascinating read, and there's just so many wonderful details in it. And I just thought, wow, there's something in this. And it just may be too dry and a bit too dreary to sort of have an instant appeal. But I've always thought about this woman's story and that setting and that world. And I came up with more probably viable ideas. But this is the one I feel like I'm personally most interested in. So I'm writing that one now and kind of getting it out of my system, I guess, before I move on to something that's more kind of, I guess, movie friendly.
Fantastic. So, Andrew, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your books, where can they find you?
For somebody who markets movies, I've really failed on myself. I have an Instagram at Andrew Mackie, which I've updated twice. I update it once a decade. Oh. My first post is my dog 10 years ago. And my next post was the release of my book. So in 10 years, there might be another post. But no, Penguin have a page for the book. And I'd say stick with my Instagram, because if I ever end up actually doing what I should be doing, and that's building a social following, that'll be the starting point. It's terrible. Penguin will be horrified if I hear this. And it's something I should be doing. I feel like I should be setting up all those Facebook page and building my audience. And I have trouble talking about and I don't feel comfortable marketing myself, and I should. You've got to get comfortable doing that, because I think you've got to think about the next book and the book after that. So don't follow my example.
So, Andrew, I wanted to say congratulations once again on the tour. It was a wonderful book that I think any Anglophile or any royalist will absolutely lap up. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much, Claudine.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.